what I want to talk about is smelling salts and why smelling salts are not used today in boxing. You know, if you watch a couple throwback fights, no matter what throwback fight it may be, even in the 1980s, fighters were allowed to use smelling salts between rounds. But then later on, in the same 1980s, these same fighters were not allowed to use smelling salts. It was actually illegal to do so. So let's just go into why smelling salts are not allowed anymore in boxing. First of all, smelling salts in Wikipedia, they talk about the action of smelling salts on the body. And basically, what all of this is saying here is that smelling salts, they have an action to revive a person. So if a person is fainting off or they're tired, you use smelling salts and basically they revive. The action is based on ammonia. Smelling salts basically releases ammonia. Ammonia triggers inhalation by irritating the lining, what we call the mucous membranes or the lining of the nose and the lungs. And that triggers the muscles to contract and it causes increased breathing and enhanced breathing. Okay? And that reaction affects the nervous system and causes the nervous system, a certain version of it called the sympathetic nervous system, to increase not just breathing but elevate heart rate, blood pressure, and brain activity. So a person revives and they're alert almost instantaneously, and their heart rate goes up, their blood pressure, etc. So boxers, basically when they're fighting in a fight, when they come to the end of the fight, at the end of the round, that is, to their corner, when they get their water, they breathe deeply, they get smelling salts, so they are administered smelling salts, immediately they get super alert. If they were tired, if they were fatigued, that goes away, and they're ready again to take on a next round. They feel refreshed and everything. Now, the dangers involved in that is this. Prolonged exposure to ammonia, everybody knows ammonia is a toxic gas. So if you have prolonged exposure or excessive exposure to ammonia, there are fatal effects or toxic effects that happen. And there are a number of them that are mentioned here. So we talk about one, it burns the nasal or oral linings. They are called the mucosal linings or membranes of your nose and your lungs. And if that lining is damaged very badly, you can get infections, and those infections can lead to diseases and death. The other point with prolonged exposure is that now if you are exposed too much, you are getting damaged round by round, but you're not seeing the symptoms of that because now the person, they may have almost been knocked out cold the round before. Just because they were saved, they get smelling salts, they go into the next round refreshed, but they actually still have the damage, the trauma, the brain damage or the spinal damage or whatever damage. And the last point is that when you're exposed to smelling salts, it can actually make worse a injury, a pre-existing injury that you had from a fight before, or it could be a neuronal injury where you've damaged your spine, but that injury actually is traumatized by using ammonium salts, because the ammonium salts, they actually irritate the neuronal injury, especially if it's a spinal neuronal injury. And that's why you have a lot of boxers today who have brain damage, some serious brain damage, is because they actually were injured fights before, and then that injury, when they're fighting in a real match, the smelling salts actually masks that injury. So they're functioning very alert and sharp and everything, but they're actually badly brain damaged. Okay? So for those reasons, smelling salts, when it was discovered that smelling salts played a role in how boxers get injured in so many different ways and even poisoned because it's being used so regularly, you use smelling salts, in between 12 rounds or 15 rounds, and that means 15 times you're administering that smelling salts. It may be in small amounts, but it's still going to have a cumulative effect, right? So that's one point why it was abandoned. The second point why it was abandoned was because when boxers are injured, the injuries that they're accumulating as well, not only are they being poisoned, but now they have injuries that they're sustaining in between rounds, and the smelling salts mask that. And so sometimes a fighter drops down dead at the end of a fight, and people don't understand why, but it's because he's been injured so bad, and then the accumulation of punishment he's taken through fights before, and all of that's been masked by the smelling salts. And then, of course, the final point. Since smelling salts are banned in boxing today, a person using smelling salts today in between rounds, he's actually cheating because the other person is not using smelling salts. So that person now, they come into a round much more refreshed and alert, while the other person still has natural fatigue as the body's supposed to have. Now the guy who's naturally alert has an advantage over the one who's not. So that's why smelling salts has been banned, for basically for protective reasons to the fighters. And then if somebody was to use it, it's just like if they were to use a PED, some sort of performance enhancing drug, which allows the fighter not to fatigue or to revamp them before a fight. And it becomes an unfair advantage. So all of these reasons are why smelling salts are not used in boxing today. I just draw your attention to Marcos Maidana versus Adrian Broner. Why I draw this to your attention is because I suspected that Alex Ariza gave Marcos Maidana smelling salts in between a round where Adrian Broner was beating him up. And I think that can easily be identified by the fact that Marcos Maidana came out a lot more sharper and alert in the round after he was administered smelling salts. And to be honest with you, corners sometimes cut corners. They cheat. They use smelling salts in fights. And it's kind of, you can tell when somebody uses smelling salts by how the boxer reacts after getting administered smelling salts. Okay? But as I said before, a lot of throwback fights, they use smelling salts. The smelling salts allowed fighters who should have been seriously fatigued to really deal out some serious punishment to other fighters. And you can look at fights like Ray Leonard versus, the first fight, Ray Leonard versus Roberto Duran. Smelling salts were allowed in that fight, even though smelling salts at the time was actually banned. That fight in Canada, that's one. You can think of a number of others before that time, before the 1980s. I think smelling salts was banned. It started to become banned somewhere around 79 into 80, I think, 1980. So I just wanted to give you guys this little tidbit. I always come with something interesting for boxing. You guys might have wanted to know why smelling salts is not used in boxing today. These are the reasons. They're health reasons. As I said before, boxing is evolving. It has evolved a lot. It's come a long way, folks. You guys have a great one.